thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I've been in the industry for over 20 years, starting off as a documents runner, which is probably not much of a surprise to anyone who understands the freight and customs game in this country or around the world. That role's obviously been obliterated by technology now. I'm based out of Sydney, but my regions, I cover 3 regions for Expeditors in the capacity of supply chain solutions, which is North Asia, South Asia, Middle East and Africa. So I have quite a large region in which I cover, and I work across a lot of countries and jurisdictions and am exposed to a lot of the emerging challenges that are coming out of this probably once in a generation or the first time in the last 70 years enormous shift in supply chain. Today will feel a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. I do want to cover as much as I can because I think it's very important for you to share in some of the perspective that I see. And I'm glad it's being recorded so that you can come back to it as well. In the presentation, it'll be divided up into a few different parts. I'll just make sure I'm navigating here correctly. There'll be 4 parts. I'll cover VUCA and supply chain, how I see Australia can succeed in this coming period, supply chain and procurement in APAC now and into the future, and specifically our digital twin. So that is a software as a solution service that we operate inside supply chain and solutions. It's a paid for service. And this is more of a presentation in the digital twin sense, just for you to see how a technology is actually being applied in the real world of supply chain. Hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. All right, so jumping straight in. You may be aware of the term VUCA. It came out of the United States military and it's now used across business. And I think it's very apt in describing what we see in supply chain today. It stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Translating that into what we see happening, particularly in APAC supply chains, is that a lot of businesses are talking now about supply chain resiliency, which I think is misplaced in some respects because a company must be resilient in order for its supply chain to be resilient. Yet somehow these things are spoken about separately. That you will hear about this move from just-in-time inventory to just-in-case. That means holding more inventory near where manufacturing is occurring or near where stock is being consumed. The other piece is China plus 1. China plus 1, 2, 3 to the power of X is causing an enormous amount of VUCA inside supply chain. Moves are being made inside operations without the full understanding of what's going wrong. Then there's all the nearshoring, reassuring, friendshoring. Safety at sea covers all of those flashpoints in the world. Just most recently, the Red Sea, that's causing problems. And the one that's spoken the least about, but I did hear it when I was at the S&P Global Conference just earlier this week, is the tsunami, which is what the World Bank calls it, of global debt. APAC is in a very precarious position in that the countries that surround us are getting swallowed by the amount of debt that has just accelerated during COVID. Interest rates are one thing. However, if you read anything on the World Bank website, it'll put a shiver through your spine when it comes to considering debt. So as a combination, when looking at supply chain, we don't just look at it now from the network design. Companies are having to get out of China or change the way that their supply chain is designed because of tariffs, because of what we've seen with wars around the world. And they are looking at it through what I call a cube of analysis: the geopolitical, supply chain, trade compliance, tax and legal. At our company, we have consultancies for geopolitical, supply chain, trade and compliance, but not so much tax and legal. When we convert that and we say, okay, those areas mentioned before, where does each fall under? I've tried to design that here. So under tax and legal, it's an interesting thing, is that companies are looking at how do they position their headquarters in the APAC region to pay the lowest amount of corporate tax. Modern slavery is also very important as well, because this China plus 1 concept means that you want to still find a low-cost country to manufacture your widget in, but modern slavery rules are forcing companies to think very carefully about that before just quickly up and moving where they make their goods. So, what's this meaning right now in the real world? We're facing probably a dynamic shift in power across the globe. And there are hints to what's occurring, and then there are obvious things. The obvious thing right now in Singapore is it is absolutely red hot. Warehouse space costs a fortune. Rents have gone up 60 to 70%. Companies just simply can't afford to have low-cost goods sitting on the shelves in Singapore for very long, if at all. So that's pushing supply chains into countries like Malaysia and Thailand, and in some instances Vietnam and the Philippines. Carbon reporting is forcing companies to look at their supply chains from a sustainability perspective. Geopolitical, you may have noticed that last year, for the first time ever, Australia's been made to stand on its own 2 feet when it comes to weapons production. This is because the US Navy is withdrawing from the world. So the geopolitical consequences of that for this country are enormous. We need to have safe ways to move freight around the world. And initially, in most of our histories, that was the British Navy. After World War II, that was replaced by the US Navy, and now the US Navy's pulling back, hence why we have submarines. So the era we're moving into looks nothing like the era we're coming out of. So Australia, in order to compete, again, because I see this happening up in Asia and what they're doing, and the Middle East, is that we need to look at our manufacturing and our R&D base in this country and work out how to get highly competitive in that space very quickly. What we need to do that around taxation from a supply chain perspective is look at free trade zones and economic exclusive zones. Nested around that is our infrastructure. We have our visible infrastructure of ports and rail and airports, but the invisible infrastructure comes into that free trade zones and the ability to move goods in and out without the obligations of paying duties and taxes. We're all high-fiving ourselves in Sydney that we duplicated the rail line from Port Botany into Moorebank. In a word, it's pathetic that we're excited about that. It's enormous risk to supply chains that's the main rail link, and the fact that Australia doesn't have a national rail footprint is a massive problem for us. Energy. Low-cost energy is what companies are seeking out when it comes to moving their manufacturing bases, and nesting all of that together are trade deals. So as I said before, the visible versus the invisible trade deals are being done. We talk about China plus one, and we're looking at then how do we sell more into India. Well, China, recognizing that money's coming out of it, is moving to the Middle East and Europe as well, having just recently inked a deal with France in order to drum up investment back into China. So China's doing its own version of China plus one as well. So they're not standing by whilst companies depart. Australia, from an energy perspective, and there's a lot of politics around this, and I'm not interested in that, quite frankly. But the reality is that Australia, UK, and Japan are as expensive as EU electricity prices. And if you look at this slide here, you can see that the countries that we compete in around here have much cheaper energy, and particularly as we consider, and I'll talk a little bit about the Middle East, this is a major problem for us as we try to maintain a manufacturing base in this country. Free trade zones, I don't know if you know the history of free trade zones in Australia, but it's pretty sad. We've attempted a free trade zone once. We put it in Darwin where there was no people and there was no businesses, thinking we would attract businesses out of Hong Kong. This was back in the 90s. It cost a lot of money and it failed. Now, it's not that we shouldn't do free trade zones. We have an inefficient Nature 10, Nature 20 approach and duty drawbacks in regards to this process today. There are free trade zones all over the region in APAC and in our nearest neighbours, as you can see here. And what it does is it creates a boon for manufacturing and investment. We are building the new Sydney International Airport, but we don't have a free trade zone. The issue with the Darwin Free Trade Zone matters about constitutionality as well. And in the United States of America, every state can open its own free trade zone, and the same should apply here in Australia as well. Free trade zones are the location not just for where manufacturing can be placed, but universities as well, in terms of that co-investment from business into universities for R&D, and then universities taking that R&D and putting it into widgets that those businesses make in order to then those businesses to remain a competitive edge, is something that then fosters a very positive loop and builds up our skill base in this country. We are missing this free trade zone. You don't necessarily need to have a greenfield site as a free trade zone. You can have a business register where it is today and have its operation registered under a certain use. And yes, there's paperwork involved in it, but it's very successful in Singapore. Not everything's working out of ALPS free trade zone. There are companies completely outside of that who have that status and are able to gain all those benefits. So we need to start thinking smartly about this. And I've touched on R&D already. So if we think to ourselves, this is an enormous task, how can it be done? I just wanted to point out the Middle East and particularly Saudi Arabia initially. So it was just 12 years ago that if you wanted to go to Saudi Arabia, you needed to be invited by a member of the royal family. It literally had to be a letter. You couldn't move around without being accompanied. But today, it's open. And its main ocean port is absolutely smashing records. They partnered with the Port of Rotterdam in order to develop their ocean landside infrastructure. It's a country that you are free to travel there as a tourist, and it is growing in popularity in that regard. Saudi Arabia has the petro money to invest, and it's doing it very intelligently from all reports, and it will continue to grow and develop it. UAE with Dubai, you may not be aware, but it's beaten Hong Kong and it's beaten Rotterdam in processing TEUs. It might come as a surprise to a lot of people, but the world is shifting and things are changing quite dramatically. So certainly my point here is that if we look at Australia and we say, well, we're in a bad part of the world and, it's difficult, it's hard. Every country has challenges. It's all about that vision and desire to be successful. So that just gives you a bit of an update globally, what's occurring and what I get to see from firsthand from a freight, customs and supply chain compliance perspective, and then also what our customers are having to deal with right now from a supply chain strategy perspective as well. But if we look at this now from the perspective of our people, so the people coming up through TAFE, through the universities in some respect in regards to supply chain, what are they going to face in the coming years, as in from this year on? We're moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. Supply chains are becoming more complex, and I'll explain why. They're stretching, not necessarily becoming shorter, even with all the talk about nearshore and rearshore. Data is certainly the next battleground. And demographics, aging populations, it's happening everywhere, even in the countries with the largest populations like India and China. There's irreversible population decline as these populations age across the West. The birth rate just isn't at the replacement rate, and immigration's not going to solve it. So as a supply chain professional, as a procurement professional walking into this, the ability to look inside the supply chain and find savings just isn't what it used to be. So the perspectives here, and I would encourage you to look it up, The Economist, and it says here, the analysis by the Bank of International Settlements shows supply chains are growing longer and more complicated, while their origins remain mostly unchanged. Certainly, I agree with that, and I'll suggest why. Peter Zane, he's talking about the backing away of the US out of the global order, and globalization is changing significantly. And he's dealing with, we are going to now have to work with something that is fundamentally new, and certainly that was expressed at the S&P Global meeting earlier in the week as well, that this is going to be a new globe for the next generation and the current to actually have to navigate. So what did it look like for a good part of the last 20, 30 years and at least most of my career? Well, I call this typical design the FOB China design. And from a logistics perspective, the main Incoterm that we had to deal with and out of China, which was the big factory of the world, and I know there are other locations, but keeping the example simple, the main term was just FOB, or maybe at a pinch Ex Works. Now, for procurement, it made their job very easy. From procuring products, everything was in China. You just needed to pick the right factory within the right zone, and you could play each other off each other to get that right price. Consequently, the carriers, the freight forwarders, and everyone in between were also located nearest where the freight came out of. So they provided essentially the same type of service. So negotiating on price was very simple to do because it was very clear the processes that took place. Goods went into DCs and then they were delivered. The other major factor here, and something you may be aware of, this term agglomeration. In the context of supply chain, what China has done incredibly well is locate the raw material and semi-finished good factories on, around, or near the main factory making the finished goods. So all of the iPhone parts and pieces are made in factories, the glass, the components, etc., are close to where the iPhone is actually made. It's just a truck move. So as we go, and what we're dealing with right now is that companies are moving this China plus one, their factories into all sorts of countries around the world. Vietnam has been the biggest beneficiary by far. Now, for procurement, there is a new leg of logistics and supply chain. There is a new node that they have to procure for to get the goods, the semi-finished goods and raw materials into the factory. Then there's the outbound to the DCs. Now, there's extra costs they have to deal with, and now service levels. Every Incoterm under the sun is being used by these different factories. So it's not just as clean as it used to be when it came to Incoterms. And the other trouble for procurement is that not every freight forwarder is as good out of each of these locations. So it now means finding the best freight forwarder, and that means less competition, which means prices can't come down as quickly as previously. From a risk perspective, these extra touch points or any additional touch point you add into freight adds risk, theft, pilferage, damage, and time. So as earlier before what the economist said, supply chains are stretching. They certainly are. And this is because most companies can't achieve agglomeration around their new factories in these locations. I'm not saying it's easy, but relative to moving all of the supporting factories, it's simple to move your factory into this new country. You can't bring along everyone else with you. For starters, there's other factories still competing with you back in China that use these semi-finished goods and finished goods factories anyway. So what's happening is that they are suffering with this extended lead time and cost of getting the raw material into the factory. Some businesses are bringing along the factories. And in one example, last year, the company Samsung celebrated that in the north of Vietnam that they had achieved effectively agglomeration. It took them a decade and over $1 billion. So that is not going to apply to the vast majority of businesses. So this stretched supply chain, China being relied upon as this main factory of the world, isn't going anywhere, even with these China plus one strategies. So what are companies doing in response to this? Well, what I see as a trend is what I call the rise of the global distribution center / regional distribution center. And what this is doing is providing a stabilizing factor into this supply chain. Effectively, what's being done is that the Global distribution center or regional distribution center puts to the left of it all of the complicated supply chain and that stretched supply chain, and to the right of it, everything else that was what it used to be, deliver into a DC in a country and get it to the end customer. So, pardon me. So where are we seeing these GDCs or RDCs pop up? Well, here are the locations across the world in which that they will occur, and I'll let you read that while I take a sip of tea. But the key point here is there's none in Australia. All right, we just don't have the mechanisms in place to attract the GDC, RDC at scale. So the typical design then that we're finding in the supply chain is that main agglomeration is occurring in China. Yes, there are other countries where that's coming out. Companies are moving their manufacturing around. Some are moving entire production lines out of China. Others are drip feeding particular SKUs out of China, but still keeping a supply base. These, for our region, Vietnam and India, are the biggest beneficiaries. However, generally speaking, 70% is China manufacturing still, 10% Vietnam, 5% India. Varies customer by customer, absolutely. And these aren't static numbers. Certainly in peak periods as you get, say, towards Christmas, and you may never use those suppliers through any other time of the year, but at Christmas you do, all those suppliers are in China, that number might go up to 80, 90% in terms of your reliance on China as a factory. So this is seasonally driven as well. Just main point here is that we're stretching supply chains, making them complicated, but by no means are we taking our business out of China in a significant way yet. RDCs, if you're a global company, you've got one strategically for Europe and maybe the UK separately, one for Asia and one for North America. Typical book move. And then what we see is the country distribution center. So a main center within a country to then service the domestic market. So country distribution center could be in any of the countries in APAC, same for North America, then off to the consumer. From an Incoterm perspective, FOB out of China, ex-work still reigns supreme. For every other country where raw materials are coming from, it's every Incoterm under the sun. Out of these locations, China, Vietnam, India, it is normalizing around ENF Incoterms for export, and then F, C, and D terms out of these locations into their end consumer. It just depends on maybe legacy situations or who wants to take control of the customer service within the logistics part of the supply chain. So there was a bit of a trend to make everything X works, and then it wasn't your problem until then it became the exporter's problem because goods were being lost even if the importer was nominating who the freight forwarder was, and then the problem was still ending up on the plate of the exporter. So some of them have gone back and put in the CFR Incoterms so that they can select the forwarder and they can manage them and hold them to a standard, so they're not running around chasing forwarders that they've never appointed in the first place to deliver on the services and deliver the product. So this is, again, a typically emerging supply chain that we are seeing. Okay, so now I will jump into our supply chain digital twin. In the area of all of this, and certainly where more and more interest is growing for a supply chain digital twin, is because of the complexity piece, and also the acknowledgement from COVID that the supply chain had been poorly served when it came to data capture and retention policies. During COVID, a lot of businesses did the old Mother Hubbard, went to the cupboard when it came to look at their data, and the cupboard was bare. So since that period of time, there has been an investment in improving the quality and consistency, robustness, if you will, of supply chain data. If you understand your data in your supply chain, it's like understanding the rules of your favorite sport. The better you understand the rules, the more capable you are and professional you are at playing the game. We see teams that go onto the field and they're horrendous at the rules, and they break the rules and they foul, and it's an awful game to watch and no one wants to play with them. So it does pay everyone dividends to really understand the rules. And for supply chain, the rules are written in the data because every customer, their business operates their supply chain slightly differently. It's not that there's a general rule book that you can just open up and follow. So there's the physical supply chain and the digital supply chain. The number one factor for us is that we take data from every carrier, forwarder, everyone else. So although we sit inside Expeditors, we are governed by non-disclosure agreements and separate terms and conditions. So that way we can get data from all the different freight companies and parcel companies, warehouses, customs, etc., and get it into this one data point. And inside the digital twin, here again, we're just example here on the left of the data that we're taking in. The customer wants to be able to filter by their different service providers, but they also want to dig into deeply the product origin and then not only get that visibility to see their supply chain, but then to be able to model. And no one's trying to model different scenarios for their supply chain to predict the future. That's a fool's errand. What they're trying to do instead is look at multiple potential futures for their supply chain. So currently the scenarios of what if the Red Sea situation becomes worse and the Suez Canal closes completely? What is the impact? What if the Red Sea issue is resolved and everything moves back to moving through the Suez and not around Africa? What if the droughts in the Panama Canal become worse? What is the impact then to trade through the Panama Canal for our supply chain? Those are the types of questions that you want to look at to then plan accordingly, not react that, oh no, the Panama Canal's shut, now what do we do? It's preparing for it before it occurs. A lot of businesses had nothing on the table in terms of preparation for COVID. This is their time now to look at these different scenarios and start testing it and stress testing their supply chain under them so that they can be prepared for the next disruption. And if there's anything you've taken from this, disruption is the new norm. Okay, so when we talk about data in the supply chain, one thing that your students need to be aware of is that data is terrible, absolutely shockingly bad. 98% of businesses, data is just a disaster zone. And everyone will think that will only be the small to medium-sized enterprises. It's not. It's big business, enormous business. Their data is shockingly bad. It's siloed. It's worse than siloed. I can't emphasize enough. And they should be prepared that when they walk into these companies, that data is going to be a problem for them. This is from Boston Consulting Group and a study that they did when it looked at digitalization of the supply chain. And they saw that around 30% of companies are stagnating in terms of digitalization. And 51% are in that emerging area. Less than 4% would be future built. I think these numbers are slightly overstated, but it's a good study nonetheless, just to at least give you a snapshot of the situation of digitalization in the supply chain. It is majority poor. So that could be disappointing, and I particularly think to a younger generation that's looking at how to apply the latest technology. It's simply not able to be applied until the data issue is solved. That's why when people talk a lot about, well, AI is going to replace a lot of jobs, not in supply chain. You can't replace, AI can't replace you if the data isn't there. So that's certainly an area where supply chain needs to drastically improve, and we're doing our part to do that. So where a customer is in that scaling to future built inside our digital twin, what are they able to do? Well, one client right now, so this was the report as of April, they were currently running all of these studies concurrently. So a tariff compare study, so they're measuring their year-over-year tariffs. So if a carrier or forwarder says we've saved you $50 a container on last year's tariff or last quarter's tariff or last whatever tariff, we're measuring that. We're validating the billing that's coming in and getting them credits back. A lot of these tariffs are updating more often than year over year, causing more discrepancies in bill outs because people look at the old tariff and bill it rather than the new one. They're doing a source shift. They're looking at a China Plus One policy for a particular SKU, and that scenario is being run for them. We're optimizing their warehouse space. Twice daily reports of their 3PLs around North America are going into the digital twin, and the literal space that they're using inside the four walls is being optimized to reduce their storage costs plus other handling costs. And from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, we are down to calculating emissions per item from cradle to grave from that supply chain perspective. So they're very advanced in this greenhouse gas emissions reporting piece. And so what I'd like to do, we have a demo site for this, and I'd like to be able to show you that just so you know that I'm not talking about something that doesn't exist in the real world. And so certainly, just Chris, can you see my Google? Yep. So this is our digital twin in the demo mode, and you can see across the top we have these different tabs: an executive summary, baseline, time analysis, asset utilization, spend, carbon footprint, regional analysis, and a couple of others I can't see because of the way that the sharing is occurring. But anyway, what's happening here that's not happening elsewhere when it comes to supply chain analysis? Well, supply chain consultants love a new supply chain project because they get to build a baseline for the client. Every new project, they build a new baseline. So they get to charge to do the same thing over and over again. Now that baseline, once it's done, they then run their study, but the baseline becomes irrelevant to a company a couple of hours after it's built, because the world can shift. Every baseline that was built in March 2020 became irrelevant in April 2020 when the world started shutting down with COVID. So in a persistent baseline, which is what we build in the digital twin, is we work with the customer and they invest in having the data persistently update into this system. So it's automated once a month. It comes from their service providers, from their own systems, TMSs, WMSs, into the digital twin. So the baseline, which you can see here, is always built. And then they can just focus on doing studies. So these are filters. You've got shipments, and then you can filter by carbon, you can filter by ore types. Then you can drill, customers can then drill into their analysis, parcel, air, truck, etc. And the baseline is just there, ready to go for them. There are many other categories that they can then analyze. Now, under asset utilization, what we're able to do is establish in there for them their KPIs. And so they can see then what their utilization is of their containers as the data comes in. They can then set their KPI in it. Are they above or below? And then manage their vendors accordingly. When it comes to spend, and so the biggest area for us in the digital twin is spend. So we help customers run RFQs through the digital twin and also audit tariffs as well. And that's really making sure that they are being very efficient in their expenditure. So you can see we're monitoring by category, by total, and by percentage for spend. Importantly as well, under the sustainability piece, is the carbon footprint. And the carbon footprint modeling we're doing for customers, we use an external piece of software called EcoTransit, which is the gold standard for supply chain and logistics for carbon measurement and reporting. And it meets all of the global requirements, no matter what stock exchange, whether you're talking about the ISSB standards or the scientific-based standards, etc. It meets that. So that's why we selected it. And it lets us do things like tank-to-wheel and well-to-wheel analysis for customers. They can then see their different modes of transport. We can have truck biofuel in there as well, any type, if they're using EVs, if they're putting solar panels on the roofs of their warehouses to reduce down the carbon footprint of their warehouse so that we can say their warehouse has a different type of emissions factor. All of this falls under what's called Scope 3 emissions in the supply chain. There are 15 parts to Scope 3, and within that, parts 4 and 9 deal with upstream and downstream supply chain, logistics and distribution. And that's what our focus is in here for customers. So right now, a lot of it is just getting that carbon data into the one place and having the reports ready to go for listed companies to put in their annual reports and to send to the stock exchanges on which they're listed, plus also government authorities. And for private companies, a lot of them are beginning to do this model reporting as well, because their customers are asking for it. They could be a listed company and they're having to give them that data. So we'll see that this carbon modelling piece will come very, very important, along with all of the other types of scenario planning we do inside this. So as we, as we wrap up, the focus for us in the digital twin is that it's a managed service for us. And the reason why I say that is that we still see that you can't remove people from supply chain. That just isn't going away anytime soon. It's about merging the best quality data with the best quality person to help the customer interpret information, do the analysis, interpret results, and then intelligently go and implement that change in the company. There are a lot of variables of making changes inside supply chain, and a lot of consultation has to occur across a lot of disparate teams, both geographically and just competently. Finance and legal need to be involved, marketing, real estate, legal, tax, etc. So our objective with this and our purpose is to get such high quality information into the supply chain that for supply chain leaders, they can bring those people around this data and information, show the impacts of their decisions on the business at large, and then acknowledge that those changes will occur, measure them, and report them back to the company after they've happened, so they can control it, rather than this be supply chain is something that happens to you from the outside and just lands on you and impacts you, and somehow it's completely out of your control. You can't stop a tornado ripping through a terminal. However, you can control the way you respond to that. So that's our purpose with this. Again, I'll reiterate, it's not about taking people away or out of logistics. I see that as being something far away. It will happen within localized pockets, I guess, of the industry, but this is still very much a people-based and a relationship-based industry. Okay, that's my entire presentation today.